We are eager to move on to our keynote speech, which will be offered by Professor Himadri Lahiri. And the chair of this session will be Professor Shamshad Mortaza, Dean of School of Arts and Humanities and Acting Vice Chancellor at ULAB. May I please request Professor Mortaza to introduce our keynote speaker?
Thank you so much, Laura. All right. So it's my pleasure to welcome Professor Himadri Lahiri, our keynote speaker today. Professor Lahiri is former professor of English, University of Bardhaman, West Bengal, and currently he is professor of English at the School of Humanities, Netaji Subhash Open University, Kolkata, India, and Asia Travels, Pan-Asian Cultural Discourses, Diasporic Asia. So his publications include Asia Travels, Pan-Asian Cultural Discourses and Diasporic Asian Literatures in English, then Diaspora Theory, Transnationalism. So these have come out from Orient Black Swan in 2019. And he also writes book reviews for academic journals and newspapers. And of course, he is part of this poetry blog, Borderless, and he writes poems occasionally. So it's again my privilege to welcome our keynote speaker for his keynote speech. Professor Lahiri, over to you.
Thank you so much, Professor Mortaza, Professor Shamshad Mortaza, Acting Vice Chancellor, University of Liberal Arts, Bangladesh, Professor Imran Rahman, my colleagues at the ULAB, participants, and friends. Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for inviting me. I think I have 50-minute slot in which I will be speaking for about 40 minutes. And I'm very happy that the keynote ideas have already been communicated to all of us, because first of all, you know, the brave Afghan girls narrated their experiences and talked about the problems, the basic problems, and offered us some insights into the situations, and also how we could see the problems as it exists in Afghanistan today. The basic problem or the basic issue is how, as citizens of neighboring countries and citizens of the world, we can respond to what Afghanistan represents for us at the moment, and how can we really respond effectively in order to understand and tide over the crisis through which all of us are going today. These narratives of journeys, I think, are very important, and they have already set the tone of the conference. They are the first-hand experiences, and we have some ideas about what is happening within Afghanistan and how desperate is the situation there. My presentation will basically concentrate on the images that we receive from the representations, which I think might be useful in understanding the presentations that will follow. But one of my points is also, from the question we can understand that who is narrating? This subject position is very, very important. And the subject position is important in the sense that we can have a clear idea about how, from the class position, from the position of gender, how from different other subject positions one approaches the text. As Professor Mortaza rightly points out, our task is to interpret the world as a text. So in interpreting the world as a text, it is also necessary that we should go into the texts that we have already, the literary texts, the cultural texts, and what they convey. What is there any differences between the texts that we read from the neighboring countries, like the Indian subcontinent, or from the West? So these are the questions which will crop up in my presentation. And I will also like to draw your kind attention to the fact that we often, when we refer to Afghanistan or any country for that matter, what happens is that we tend to homogenize the country and its people. So from that point of view, it is also important to keep in mind that what Afghanistan means to us. Does it mean just Kabul, or does it also refer to the neighboring areas, the districts where it is very difficult to go there because of several factors, and what kinds of situations from ethnic points of view we come across there. You remember the Kite Runner, Hosseini's novel, and there you will find that how Afghanistan is torn into different factions, and how the hegemonic factions actually perpetrate all kinds of operations on people who belong to Hazaras, for example. So when we speak of Pakistan, when we think of Afghanistan, we should remember that, like many other nations, it is also a nation where there are many fragments. So we should keep in mind who is speaking, from what position is one speaking, whether a large part of the population can really speak, can the subaltern speak. All these questions are important for our deliberation. I have jotted down my ideas about Afghanistan, and I would like to read from them, from the prepared paper. I might deviate now and then, but more or less I will stick to the main points that I have talked about. Let me begin. My title is Images of Afghanistan Through the Cultural Lens. Now, when I say through the cultural lens, of course, my position is very clear, my approach is very clear, but then it is not possible to discuss each and every cultural text that we should discuss, because the time is minimum, and therefore I will pick up some particular texts and what message or messages they convey, because we are in the vortex of time, and therefore in this situation the messages are very important. We have already come across several articulations which talk about this problem, which emphasize this problem. So in this presentation, I will deal in some detail 2 or 3 texts which might be useful for us. But when I use the text, the word text, I also include in it the images, for example, the media reports, for example, the films, although I will not be able to discuss the films in detail, I will refer to some here and there. Let me begin. Afghanistan has been in the news for about 4 decades. During this period, the country has witnessed the rise and fall of political regimes. Inextricably associated with these is the involvement of foreign powers. As rightly pointed out by Ongshu and Chatterjee, in an essay in a periodical, and I quote, "No other nation in modern history has experienced 4 consecutive decades of violence perpetuated by the actions of local, regional, and external powers who clash, invade, and then abandon in response to the shifting political and strategic interests." This was published in the periodical called The Diplomat. Unquote. After the failure of decade-long Soviet occupation that began in late December 1979, the United States stepped into the scene post 9/11. Equating Afghanistan with the Taliban's, George Bush vowed to destroy the Taliban stronghold. After a stay of about 3 decades, the United States withdrew from the country, leaving its people to their fate. In the civil war that followed, the Afghan forces in power was defeated and Taliban regime captured power. The process of the return of the Taliban was so quick that it surprised the entire world. It suggested how fragile the Western rhetoric of Afghan reconstruction scheme was and how meaningless the American stay in the country had been. It failed to rebuild an infrastructure of governance in the country and to protect the people from the threats of the Taliban. As the Afghans continued to suffer, the people from the rest of the world watched with horror the events that unfolded very quickly. Some of the events covered by the global media generated images of precarity that underlined the desperation of the people. When I use the term precarity, I of course move beyond the suggestions of just economic crisis for which people, particularly the working class people, move from place to place, the insecurity of their jobs. I want to include the overall situations that may render people very, very precarious. And this is a point that Judith Butler has stressed in his book on precarity. I will take up this idea. Some of the events covered by global media generated images of precarity that underlined the desperation of the people. While they painted the country as unhospitable, even for the native population, they, by implication, also suggested that their probable destination in the West. It is also important, as I said earlier, who is representing, who is speaking, and most of the images are offered by the Western media. Precariousness of the situation is indicated by several images. I shall mention 2 images, and these images have already been referred to by Professor Mortoja. I shall mention 2 images, both of which project the airways as the suggested pathway of escape. Out of these two, one shows us thousands of people at the airport mobbing an aircraft that waits at the tarmac. They are desperate. The people who gathered there are desperate to board the aeroplane to flee the country. Some, unable to secure space within, climbed atop the aircraft. The image underlines the inhospitable space that Afghanistan has turned into under the Taliban regime. This perception comes from the memory of the trauma that they have gone through during the last Taliban regime. The other picture relates to the aeroplane again, but this time the aircraft is not on the ground but is airborne, indicating that it has indeed left the Kabul airport and the journey has begun. But what happens then is a point of critical discussion. The image shows human bodies falling off from the airborne aircraft. We know of some other occasions in the aviation history involving flights originating from Africa where similar phenomena were reported. Simon Gikandi picks up one such incident for elaborating an aspect of globalization. He refers to two stowaways, two young Guinean boys who fled from their country to escape war, poverty, and malnutrition. They hid themselves in a Sabena Airlines Airbus originating from Conakry, Guinea to Brussels. They were going to Brussels, Belgium on 28 July 1999. Their dead bodies, frozen, were found a few days later in the aircraft's rear right-hand wheel bay. On their bodies was found a letter they wrote to the members and officials of Europe, appealing for help and refuge from Europe. I quote, "Be mindful of us. There is no one else for us to turn to." This was what the young boys wrote to the European officials. Gikandi argues that this phenomenon of young boys looking to Europe for help reflects one aspect of globalization, and I quote, "The boys were neither seeking cultural hybridity nor ontological difference. Their quest was for a modern life in the European sense of the word. Their risky journey from Africa was an attempt to escape both poverty and alterity. It was predicated on the belief that their salvation could only come from Europe, which 2 generations earlier, Black nationalists such as Jomo Kenyatta and Aimé Césaire had declared to be the major threat to the prosperity and well-being of Africa," unquote. The exact comparison between the Guinean and the Afghan stowaways might amount to an overstretching of imagination. The Guinean boys' attempt to escape was pre-planned. Perhaps it was the result of much reflections, while the African escape attempts were the result of desperation. While the Afghan escape attempts were the result of desperation and sudden instinctive decisions. Moreover, there was no proof whatsoever of whether they were motivated to seek a better life in the West or whether such a dream was deeply entrenched in their minds. However, we need to ponder over some points which may lead to such a decision. Afghanistan is a difficult country to control. Warlords rule the vast rural districts, some of which were difficult to penetrate. In some areas, they work in close alliance with the Taliban. The common people were often caught in between the two warring groups, warlords and Taliban on the one side, and the security forces deployed by the national government and the Western powers on the other. After the Taliban's return to power, there was no reason why they should think that things will be better. The Afghan citizens never thought that the things would be better. Specters of death and death-like situation must have visited those who went through traumatic experiences. Understandably, they would want to leave their country and, if possible, go to the West, the site of the dream of a better life, especially for the middle-class people. The news of the resettlement of refugees in the West must have filtered in and motivated to leave the spectre at any cost. There were, I quote, media images showing the Afghan families being welcomed at American airports. Within unquote, obviously there was politics in the visual representation of the welcome scene. Chatterjee, whom I quoted earlier, argues to send a message of Washington's position towards China and Russia, who have been more open to dealing with Taliban. The unquote, the common man is not, however, aware of such politics and get inspired by the surface meaning of the images. In fact, many of the Western countries, despite internal resistance, offered plans for rehabilitation of refugees. Germany, for example, announced that it would accept at least 10,000 Afghans. And I quote from an article written by Sophia Kai. In the US, as many as 50,000 evacuees will arrive under so-called humanitarian parole, a stopgap program that gives them a year to apply for permanent visas. Other Afghans, including those that worked directly for the US government, will be under separate immigration categories. Such moves were partly influenced by the West's demand for more labor force. Texas Medical Technology, a medical equipment manufacturer in Houston, said it had hired 5 of the 100 Afghans the company plans to engage for a variety of positions, including in textiles and engineering sections, over the next 12 months. The demand is there, said Son Reiber, co-owner of the country. We need the workers, so we are open arms to refugees. Now, you see, I said this because this is one of the contentions that in currency, in the discursive world, in the world of discourses. And I would like to refer to Judith Butler's reference to some women who appeared for a television show where they looked very happy and they didn't talk about the sufferings. So she says, where is the face? Face within quote. While speaking of the face, she was in fact referring to Emmanuel Levinas's concept of face. Levinas actually did not mean just the facial aspect of the face. This is a kind of a metaphor, a metonymy, which stands for the whole. And this metonymy actually suggests the whole body, and the whole body suffers, and when the sufferings occur, the whole body is actually, the body bears the wounds of the sufferings. So from that point of view, Levinas argued that we need to have the proper kind of face. And in the cases of the Afghan women who appeared on the TV program, the face was not very much there. But interestingly today, when we listened to the brave young girls who had to flee Afghanistan, in their speech, in their articulation, in their paintings, in their conversation, what appeared is nothing but the face that is wounded, the face that looks back to Africa, to Afghanistan, the face that mourns over the loss of the relatives and friends, and the loss of the overall tranquility that reigned there for some time, for a decade or so. So the face is a very important concept. And Levinas said that the face, when it appears, actually generates a conflict in the person who observes the face. There are twin instincts. One instinct is to kill the face because it is the other. And on the contrary, the mind says, why should you kill it? Because we should understand the face. We should come forward to help the face. And in the process, we should have an ethical understanding of the sufferings of the other. This is something that is needed most at the present moment. And therefore, in the representation, like the representation I talked, the images, for example, they are very, very important, whether they truly represent the face or not, what kind of understanding we can have today about them. You see, the faces we heard today, they communicate several messages, the messages for humanitarianism also, the messages of how we can stand by them, by the suffering, important thing together. We have already heard about Kabuliola, the Tagore story, and I will come back to that. And that is a very important story while we think of the entire episode, the episode of the subcontinent as a whole, and also Afghanistan, how we can go over to Afghanistan, because one of my narratives, in that narrative, one of the characters, the main characters, go over to Afghanistan and articulates her experiences. In the context of the West, the image may have the quality of spectacularity that is born out of a sense of difference. And as Professor Mortuza already mentioned, that Stuart Hall has, while discussing the concept of difference, all mentioned, in fact, analyzed the concept of the spectacularity. The other, there is every possibility that the other will be presented as a spectacular scene. So whether the images I have presented here, I have mentioned here, are spectacular, present spectacularity, we should all think about that. The Afghan national space is unlike, the conflict of the West. In the conflict of the West, the images may have the quality of spectacularity that is born out of a sense of difference. The Afghan national space is unlike the Western national spaces. The kind of precariousness that forces multitudes of people to leave the country because of the chaos in the nation is unlikely to occur in the West. The images may bring this asymmetry into view. Lily Chauliar-Key, in her book Spectatorship of Suffering, argues that visual media reports can indeed foreground the difference between the spectator located in the safe drawing room of mostly European countries or America and the sufferer in the maelstrom of chaos. She argues that from such viewing arises, and I quote, the question of how the spectator should relate to the sufferer and what we should do about the suffering, unquote. According to her, and I quote her again, it is these ethical values embedded in news discourse that come to orientate the spectator's attitude towards the distant sufferer. The question of distance comes here. Safety and suffering then are apt categories for understanding television's power to represent the world to the world. Its power to map the information flows in terms of geographical neighborhoods, cultural affinities, and political alliances. And by this token, to others, those who live in poverty or with war, unquote. She extends the argument that television constitutes the nation as an imagined community by homogenizing differences internal to the nation's state, by arguing that this is an extension of the argument that transnational news flows construe a beyond the nation community by establishing a sense of the broader we. This we, I assume, she says, is the imagined community of the West, which inhabits the transnational zone of safety and constitutes human life in the zone of suffering as the West's other, unquote. From this perspective of difference, most of the Western representations are produced. And if you look at the films, there are many films, in fact. For example, the film like Rambo 3rd, it combines the spirit of heroism, adventurism, romanticization, and stereotyping. This is the best, perhaps this best example of what Lily Chauliarki calls transnational zone of safety. Such representations always carry with them a sense of foreignness that creates a wall in the understanding of our neighbors. I shall discuss two short narratives which exhibit true spirit of understanding our neighbors, for which we need to take an ethical stand, something that Emmanuel Levinas calls face, which I already mentioned and analyzed in some detail. In these narratives, we shall encounter two figures of foreigners who, through their emotional involvement, transcend relational distance and try to create a sense of neighborly behavior. These two narratives are Rabindranath Tagore's Kabuliwala, The Man from Kabul, written in Bengali, and the other narrative is Jahida Hina's Kumkum is Doing Fine, which is the translation of Kumkum Thik Thak Hai. Hina is a Karachi-based fiction writer who migrated with a family from Bihar in India at the time of the partition, and who says in an interview, and I quote, I know well what it is to be an outsider. This is a very, very important comment, I feel, because this outsiderness happens in the inside of the nation she has been living at present because of the history of the partition that we come across in the continent. Excuse me, please. Tagore's story as the character Ramat, a Kabuliwala, at its center, and it projects his relationship with Minnie, the little girl whose father narrates the story. In Bengali imagination, a Kabuliwala is usually an exotic masculine person, immensely capable of violence. In fact, you see that, as has already been mentioned, Kabuliwala in our time, in our childhood, was a reality in the cities and in the villages. We could come across the figure of the Kabuliwala. So we can relate to the figure of the Kabuliwala now. But these days, it is very difficult to come across the figures of the Kabuliwala. And even when we come across them, it is very difficult to identify them as Kabuliwala because of different factors, including the changes of dresses they sometimes wear. This Rahmat is a central character in the story, and he shows a remarkable sense of tenderness towards the little girl who reminds him of his own little daughter left behind in Afghanistan. Through his affectionate relationship with Mini, whom he used to offer dry fruits as a token of love and affection, and whose innocent companionship largely compensated his sense of separation from his own daughter, he emerges as a prototypical father figure. This does not mean that his appearance did not arouse a sense of difference and even dread. In the beginning, both Mini and her mother were afraid of Kabuliwala because of his foreign appearance. The bag he carried was also the subject of intense suspicion. He was stereotyped as a child lifter. The apprehension of Mini's mother is revealed in the following comment. And I quote, when I tried to, in the comment that he may be a lifter. And the father figure, the narrator, says, when I tried to laugh away her suspicion, she posed me some questions, one after another. Hasn't anybody's child been ever kidnapped? Is there no slave trade in the land of Kabul? Is it absolutely impossible for a hefty Kabul to carry away a child? Unquote. Mini too was curious about the bag, and their conversation runs like the following. As soon as my daughter saw Rahmat, she would ask, laughing, Kabuliwala, oh Kabuliwala, what do you have in your bag? Rahmat would laugh and respond, unnecessarily adding a nasal tone. An elephant, of course. The conversation evolved around such trifles, and Kabuliwala gradually developed a deep affection for the girl. This relationship was suddenly disrupted by his imprisonment, which resulted from his stabbing a person who denied having taken loan from him. When after an 8-year-long imprisonment, he came back to meet Mini, she had grown up and her memory about the Kabuliwala had faded. It is this moment of vacuity that generated a sense of crisis in Rahmat. It was time for him to remember directly his daughter and not vicariously through a medium, Mini. It was Mini's wedding day, and it was difficult for an outsider to meet her on the auspicious day. In the keeping with his old habit, Rahmat wanted to offer Mini his gift of dry fruits, and the narrator wanted to pay him for the gift. Deeply hurt at this, Rahmat informed the speaker, listen, sir, as you have a daughter, so do I have one in my own country. I recall her face and bring some fruits for your daughter. I don't come here to sell the fruits. Saying this, he brought out of his bag a loose piece of paper of an old. It was an old dirty paper from, and he unfolded the paper very carefully and placed that on my table with both his hands. I saw the impression of a small hand on the paper. It is not a photograph, neither is it an oil painting. It is rather the impression of a sooty hand on the paper. Rahmat comes to Calcutta every year to sell dry fruit with this memento of his daughter kept in close proximity to his heart, as if the touch of the soft hand of the child spreads a heavenly bliss through his huge, pining heart. This opened the floodgate of empathy. in the narrator who realized the depth of pain in Ramat. Ramat had all along been carrying with him this pain. He summoned Mini from the indoors. Seeing Mini in a bridal dress, Ramat was no longer able to relate the grown-up Mini to the child Mini that remained sketched in his memory. He could not revive the old familiar conversation. It dawned on him that in Afghanistan, his daughter had also grown up in the intervening years, and he would have to renew his old ties with her afresh. From this perspective, there is no difference between the speaker, an Indian, and Ramat, a Kabuliwala. Despite the national differences, they become the prototypical father figure. The speaker asked the distressed father to return to his daughter. Curtailing the marriage expenses, he offered Ramat some money and requested him to go back home. Foreignness, I think, may I have 5 minutes or 5 or 6 minutes, please?
Yes, please proceed. No worries. Thank you.
Foreignness is an uncritical assumption that overlooks the deep structure of human affiliation between individuals. Unless we ignore the surface differences, we cannot reach an understanding with our neighbors. The above narrative offers us a roadmap to be followed for a closer understanding of the peoples across the national borders. It has been argued earlier that it is through common man's efforts that a strong fraternal space can be carved. This is face-to-face meeting that can summon fraternal feelings. Over the decades, Tagore's Kabuliwala evokes emotive responses that influences readers beyond Bengal. Syed Mujtaba Ali's Deshe Bideshe mentions that Tagore's character is even known in Afghanistan. So strong indeed is the influence that Jaheda Hina, located in Pakistan, wrote a sequel to the story. Her story, Kumkum is Doing Fine, Kumkum Tik Tak Hai, takes up the issue of the suffering Afghans, not from the point of view of distant television viewing, but gets down to work in Afghanistan itself. The motivation of visiting the land of the ravaged country is the lure of the figure of Ramat the Kabuliwala and the daughter Mini. Talking of the story, Jaheda says, in this story, time has moved forward and Mini of Kabuliwala fame is a granny. Her grandmother, the granddaughter, her granddaughter Kumkum, a doctor, volunteers to go to Afghanistan after the US attack on the country. There she forms a fond bond with an injured Afghan militant. The story is written in the form of a letter to her grandmother who lives in Calcutta and is the only character who has supported his daughter's decision to volunteer in Afghanistan. Unlike her granddaughter and the grandfather, her mother is not an idealist. She observes the whole world loves the story of Ramat Kabuliwala, written by great-grandfather, but in our home, nobody talks about it except you and me. You remember that the story because you were the heroine, and I remember it because I have heard it so many times. Unquote. In the later, Kumkum recapitulates how her grandmother Mini fondly told her about Ramat, the hawker from Kabul, everything right from the first visit to our wedding day experiences. You showed me, I quote, you showed me that soiled piece of paper which dropped from Ramat's Baba's bag on the day of your marriage. Great-grandfather had kept it carefully, so whenever Ramat Baba came back, he would return it to him, but he never came back. And the colored handprint of this little daughter is still lying safely in grandfather's suitcase. Then she remembers, you have told me that you had made the daughter of Rahmat Baba an unseen friend of yours. In your imagination, you would marry your boy doll with her girl doll. Since the boy doll was yours and the girl doll would leave Kabul and come to Calcutta, great grandfather wrote stories and you were his only darling daughter. So, who could blame you if you decorated your lonely childhood with these stories? But when great grandmother heard it from you, she was angry. How could a Hindu doll be married to a Muslim one? And the wedding ceremony, according to which rites would it be held? Jaheta Ina, in fact, interweaves in the story the spirit of cosmopolitanism, the true feeling of neighborliness, and the transnational fraternity. These qualities are embedded in the characters of the grandmother and Kumkum. When Kumkum decides to go to Afghanistan as a doctor, she went to the temple. Her grandmother went to the temple and to the mosque, whereas in reality, she is somewhat of a non-conformist. But Kumkum is appalled to find that what Afghanistan has become today. And she's pained to discover there is no place for Rahmat Baba and her daughter in this country in whose trail she has gone there. She tells her grandmother, and I quote, "Had you seen this city even in the dream once, you would never have let me come here. Here, there are shadows of death on the walls of each house and the lines of blood in each street and bazaar. Rahmat Baba left ages ago. His daughter must have perished too. And who knows that her children got killed by the Soviet gunfire or by American bombing, or perhaps they died of starvation. There are devastation stalks everywhere. Each city of this country is in ruins. When I left home, you kissed my hands and told me, stitch all your hands with your hands. But Dadima, here I am, all exhausted, stitching the wounds, but the wounded, they still keep on coming." I will just end here by referring to the end of the story, where she says that perhaps many girls of Afghanistan today, there is no palm to take the picture of, because the palms may have been cut off or destroyed by bombs and everything. So the traces of the image of the old Kabuliwala can never be found in the Afghanistan of today. So with this kind of situation, the story ends. And my point is that in both these stories, the spirit of neighborliness is very much apparent, and the face is very much apparent. And the message is that the foreignness should not be stressed. We should go beyond the foreignness, because both the stories are in fact a kind of antidotes to foreignness. And from this point of view, from this location, those of us mainly who are located in the subcontinent can approach the stories of Afghanistan. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Lahiri. So you have rightly warned us about the homogenization. Of course, in the English department, we do not want to homogenize, even though we have three representative figures. And when you talked about the airport, so the airport itself becomes a microcosm of the Afghan trouble and the travel. And the very idea that, when you're posed with this question of fight or flight, so what do you do? So when you have this binary presented before you, and especially when the mighty Americans were useless before the tribal lords that you mentioned, and the different terrains in which so Rambo could glorify himself, but then again the reality was something else. So thank you for reminding us of that kind of reality. And what I liked about your presentation, the way you have laced in different theories, like Simon Gikandi's idea of cultural taste, and how the token exposure to the West is often used, and also you mentioned that using them for the labor market. I found that really insightful, and also when you used Judith Butler's idea of let's face it, so this idea of face, and Butler so said that when you face the face, and if you're not touched by it, if you're not troubled by it, then there is something wrong with us, right? And that's exactly what Tosif mentioned at the very beginning, that so the critical empathy is very important, and that's what this forum is all about. And I'm thankful, the way you referred to Kabliwala, and Kumkum is doing fine. And of course, the epistolary short story refers to Tagore as well, so the father figure and the fear that we have about a Kabliwala as a traveling salesman, and he got into a tiff, he got into a fight, and got imprisoned. So that fits into the typical stereotype of the fearsome Afghan figure. Now they have become fearsome cricketers, I suppose. So they're becoming fearsome cricketers as well, that especially for us. So they are a formidable opposition. But jokes apart, this whole idea that we should think of it from a human perspective. And as Professor Imran was saying, that so as a liberal arts school, so this is our responsibility. English department, in the English department, we have already arranged a conference on the Rohingya crisis. We were the first one to respond to that back in 2018 or 19. So just as when the trouble broke out. And we are also planning to accommodate some of the Afghan students. So the process is underway. And at the same time, as I said at the very beginning, within English studies, so one of our major thrust is on cultural studies. So we are going to read the text, as Professor Lahiri rightly said, that, so it's not only the text, it's the images, it's the process, they all matter. And, within such a brief span of time, so Professor Lahiri has covered a lot, and he has given us enough thought to explore, so I'm sure that the other sessions, the parallel sessions, will keep on doing that. I'm mindful of the time, and I would like to wrap up simply by saying a big thank you to Professor Lahiri. Thank you so much for agreeing to be our keynote speaker, and thank you for sharing our thought. We are deeply humbled and touched by your august presence.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.